The first thing Diana Holt heard when she came back to herself was the sound of a monitor beeping. Not the crash, not the sirens, not the voices that must have surrounded her in those first panicked hours. Just the steady, indifferent rhythm of a machine confirming she was still alive, as if her survival were a minor administrative fact, already logged and filed away. Her body told her the rest. Left shoulder locked and burning. Ribs that threatened to splinter with every shallow breath. A dull, deep pressure behind her eyes that turned the thin light of the room into something unbearable. She did not know how long she had been here. She did not know what time it was, or what day. She only knew that she was awake, that no one in the room was aware of it, and that two men were speaking near the door in voices they believed were private. She recognized both of them without opening her eyes. Her younger brother Stuart, and Leonard Voss, the company's senior legal counsel, a man Diana had hired 15 years ago precisely because he had no loyalty to anyone but whoever was signing his retainer. A nurse was still in the room. Diana could hear the soft shuffle of the woman's shoes, the click of a pen, the rustle of a chart being updated. While she was present, the two men spoke carefully, gently, even. Stuart asked about Diana's vitals in a tone that almost sounded like concern. Leonard nodded along, said something about keeping the board informed, keeping things calm. Then the nurse's shoes moved toward the door. The door opened, closed. The temperature in the room changed. The transfer authorization, Leonard said. We need it signed before the end of the week. I know, Stuart said. I'm working on it. The Eastgate file is the priority. If she wakes up and starts asking questions, she won't. A pause. Not in time. Diana lay still. She understood, with a clarity that cut through the fog of medication and pain, that she had two choices. She could open her eyes. She could let them know she was here, that she had heard every word, that whatever they were planning had already been compromised. Or she could wait. She had built an empire on knowing when to move and when to hold position. She had never been good at being patient with people, but she had always been exceptional at being patient with information. The right moment to act was never the moment you first felt afraid. It was the moment you understood everything. She did not understand everything yet. She kept her eyes closed. 3 weeks before the crash, Diana and Stuart had stood in her corner office on the 41st floor and said things to each other that could not be unsaid. Stuart had wanted an expanded role. He had framed it carefully, the way he always framed things, not as ambition but as operational logic, as efficiency, as what would be best for the company. He had brought a 2-page memo. He had rehearsed. Diana had listened for 4 minutes before cutting him off. You want a title, she said. You want something that sounds like authority. I want to actually be trusted. I trust you with what I give you. You give me nothing that matters. The silence after that had been the kind that does not disappear. It settles into the walls. It waits. She had worked for 20 years to build something no one could take from her. Her mother had died when Diana was 13. A sudden collapse in a grocery store parking lot. A death that had no drama and no warning, and left her father standing in a kitchen that no longer made sense. Her father had trusted the wrong people with the wrong money and lost everything by the time Diana was 18. She had watched him become a smaller and smaller version of himself, and she had made a promise, not out loud, not to anyone, just in the place inside her where she kept the things that actually drove her, that she would never be that vulnerable. She would never hand anyone that kind of lever. Stuart had grown up in the same house. He had watched the same collapse, but he had drawn different conclusions from it. He wanted belonging. He wanted to be chosen. She had never quite understood that, and he had never quite forgiven her for not understanding it. The crash happened on a Tuesday night. A wet road, a curve she had taken 100 times, and a truck running a red light. That was what the police report would say. Diana had not seen the report. She only knew what her body remembered. Impact, a sharp sideways lurch, and then nothing until the beeping. On the second day, though she did not yet know it was the second day, a man came into her room to clean it. She heard him before she registered what he was doing. The wheeled cart, the specific squeak of a mop handle, the way he moved around the furniture with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this exact route hundreds of times. He worked quietly. He did not turn on the television. He did not make calls. He simply moved through the room and did the work. Then he stopped near her bed. Diana kept her breathing slow and even. The discipline of it had become almost automatic by now, a different kind of performance than the ones she gave in boardrooms, but performance nonetheless. He was looking at her chart, or her name tag, something near the bed. When he spoke, his voice was low. Not a whisper exactly, but the kind of voice a person uses when they are talking to themselves, or to someone they do not expect to answer. Diana Holt, he said. He let the name sit there for a moment. My wife's name was Renee Webb. She died 14 months ago, in the stairwell of the Eastgate building. 3rd floor. The structural report on that stairwell had been flagged for repair 18 months before she fell. Your company owned the building. The delay order had your signature on it. Diana's chest tightened. Not from the ribs, from something else. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, he continued. I don't think you can hear me. I used to pray that God would let you feel what helplessness feels like. Just once, just so you would know. He paused. Now you're lying here. And I'm ashamed. Because part of me, a part I hate, got exactly what it wanted. He picked up his card. That's not who I want to be, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. That's not what I want Zoe to see in me. He left. Diana lay in the dark for a long time after that. She had anticipated many things when she decided to stay silent. She had anticipated learning what Stuart was planning. She had anticipated cataloging betrayals, identifying allies, preparing the counterattack she would launch the moment she was strong enough. She had not anticipated this. She had signed hundreds of documents in her career, thousands. Cost reduction orders, delay authorizations, efficiency reviews, pages of them, reviewed by legal, approved by finance, processed by people whose entire job was to make sure the numbers worked. She remembered the Eastgate project in the way she remembered most projects from that period. A name, a location, a return on investment that had satisfied her before the next item on the agenda. She had not read the structural report. She remembered that now. The meeting had been 2 days before a major investor presentation, and the engineering summary had been on page 11 of a 14-page packet, and the number attached to the repair had been significant, and her CFO had flagged a cheaper interim plan that extended the timeline by 8 months. She had approved the interim plan. It had been paperwork. To Renee Webb, it had been a staircase that gave way on a Tuesday afternoon. By the 3rd day, Diana had constructed a careful internal map of everyone who entered her room and what they wanted. Stuart visited twice daily. His concern for her recovery was, in its way, almost impressive. The softness in his voice, the way he occasionally touched her hand, the questions he asked the nurses that sounded like a devoted brother's anxiety and functioned as reconnaissance. He was learning her medical status, calculating her timeline. Leonard came once, in the morning, and spoke in low tones with whoever Stuart had positioned at the door. Diana caught fragments. Emergency board powers, fiduciary responsibility, the phrase acting in her best interests. The irony was so complete, it almost made her want to laugh. On the 3rd afternoon, Calvin returned. He gave his name this time, though she already knew it from his badge, Calvin Webb. He told her about his daughter Zoe, 9 years old, currently being watched by a neighbor after school, because Calvin worked nights and mornings, and the math of childcare on a single income was its own kind of emergency. Zoe had her mother's stubbornness and her mother's habit of asking questions that did not have good answers. She asked me last week why some people have a lot and other people have nothing, Calvin said, wringing out the mop with the efficient twist of someone who has done it 10,000 times. I told her I would think about it and get back to her. He paused. I'm still thinking. Diana noticed something she had not expected. He never spoke to her with bitterness. He spoke to her the way she imagined he might speak to the room itself, not expecting a response, not demanding one, simply filling the silence with something human because the alternative was to leave her alone in it. She did not understand this. She had spent her adult life in rooms where every word was calculated, every gesture an opening move. Calvin Webb cleaned her floor and talked to her because he believed no person should be left alone in a hospital room, regardless of who they were or what they had done. It was the most disorienting thing that had happened to her since the crash. That same evening, as the 3rd day ended, Ruth, the night nurse, a woman in her 50s, with 27 years of experience and a brand of skepticism that had compassion running just underneath, it paused at the foot of Diana's bed, longer than clinical necessity required. She studied the chart, then studied Diana's face. When she left, she did not close the door all the way. Diana filed that away. On the fourth day, Diana began to understand the true architecture of her loneliness. She had always known, in the abstract way that powerful people permit themselves to know uncomfortable things, that she was not widely loved, respected, certainly, feared, often, occasionally admired by people who confused her ruthlessness with strength and her silence with depth, but loved the kind of love that shows up without an agenda, that asks nothing from the person in the bed, that had never been a currency she had prioritized. Now she was learning the cost of that. Her assistant, a composed young woman named Claire, who had worked for Diana for 6 years and who Diana had never once asked about her personal life, appeared on the fourth afternoon and stood near the window making calls. Diana caught the shape of the conversations without the words, careful, provisional language, the kind people use when they are managing a transition. When Miss Holt's situation becomes clearer, pending the board's assessment of the timeline, we will keep you updated. A business partner Diana had known for 11 years sent flowers, an extravagant arrangement that occupied an entire corner of the room, and then stood near the door, speaking quietly to Leonard about the appropriate moment to announce the restructuring of their joint venture. He did not look at her once. A junior executive, whose career Diana had personally sponsored, came in, stood at the foot of her bed for approximately 90 seconds, and left. He had the expression of a man visiting an obligation he had already emotionally completed. Diana cataloged all of it. She had always been good at collecting information without revealing she was collecting it. But the information she was gathering now was different from anything she had gathered before, because it was information about herself, about the specific shape of what she had built and what she had failed to build, and there was nowhere to file it that did not hurt. On the 5th night, Calvin came in during a hard rain. He was quieter than usual. Diana could hear the particular heaviness of someone carrying something they had not put down in a long time. He moved through the room slowly, and when he stopped near her bed, he did not speak immediately. Then, Zoe drew a picture of her mom today. First time in 4 months she has drawn her. He cleared his throat. She drew her standing in a kitchen. Which is right, Renee was always in the kitchen. That was her place. She said our kitchen smelled like a home, and mine smells like a refrigerator. A short exhale, almost a laugh. She was not wrong. He moved to the window, wiped it down. I have been trying to figure out how to talk to Zoe about grief without making her afraid of it. Her school counselor says let her lead. But Zoe does not lead. She circles. She will get close to something and then veer off and talk about something completely different, and then 3 days later she will come back to it from a different angle. He paused. I think she gets that from me. Diana found herself listening in a way she had not listened to another person in years. Not for information, not for leverage, just listening. Following the shape of what he was saying, the way you follow a road you did not expect to be on. She thought about her own father in the years after her mother died. The way he had moved through their house like a man who had forgotten which room he was looking for. She had not known how to help him. She had been 13 and furious at everything, at her mother for leaving, at her father for shrinking, at the world for being so indifferent to both. She had channeled all of that fury into ambition, because ambition, unlike grief, had somewhere to go. She had never considered what it cost to do that. She had only tracked what it produced. On the morning of the 6th day, Stuart arrived earlier than usual. He did not come alone. Leonard was with him, and beside Leonard stood a man Diana did not recognize, mid-50s, silver-haired, with the specific posture of a doctor who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. He carried a leather portfolio and spoke with quiet authority that had nothing to do with concern for patients. His name, she would later learn, was Farrell. Diana kept her eyes closed and her breathing measured. The facility in Westbrook has a bed available Friday, Farrell said. Private room, full neurological monitoring. Everything will be documented as precautionary. And the competency assessment? Leonard asked. Given the duration of unconsciousness and the reported cognitive indicators, it is medically defensible. 30 to 60 days of evaluation, more than enough time. Stuart said nothing. He was standing at the foot of her bed. Diana could feel the particular quality of his silence, not grief, not guilt, but the tight, focused silence of a man confirming that a plan is proceeding on schedule. Friday, 3 days away. She pressed her fingers carefully against the mattress. The movement was small, a millimeter, maybe 2, but it was deliberate. Her left hand was beginning to respond to instruction. Slowly, imperfectly, but it was there. Not enough. Not yet. After they left, Ruth came in for the routine evening check. She moved through her tasks without hurry. At the door, she paused, not looking at Diana, but not leaving either. "The men who visit every morning," she said, in the careful tone of someone speaking to a room rather than a person. "One of them told me last week I was spending too much time in here, said it was unnecessary. A beat. I have been a nurse for 27 years. I decide what is necessary." She left. Diana pressed her fingers into the mattress again, and this time she felt something that might slowly, imperfectly become a plan. That afternoon, Calvin brought Zoe. He explained to Ruth at the station that he had no childcare and that he would keep his daughter quiet and out of the way. Ruth looked at Zoe for a moment, then waved them through. Zoe was small for 9, with her father's watchful eyes and a purple backpack she clutched with both hands as she walked into the room. She looked around with the frank, unsentimental curiosity of a child who has already learned that hospitals are serious places and that serious places require a certain behavior she has not yet entirely mastered. She sat in the chair beside Diana's bed. Calvin worked. He did not ask Zoe to entertain herself or to be quiet. He simply trusted her to be present in whatever way she needed to be. Zoe opened her backpack, took out a small sketchbook, and began to draw. For a while, there was no sound except the monitor, the rain against the window, and the soft scratch of Zoe's pencil. Then Zoe looked at Diana. Not with fear, not with the careful adult performance of solemnity. Just looked at her, the way children look at things they are genuinely trying to understand. "Is she going to wake up?" Zoe asked her father. "The doctors hope so," Calvin said. Zoe considered this. "I hope she wakes up different." Calvin stopped what he was doing. "What do you mean?" Like Zoe searched for the word with the visible effort of a child reaching for language that is just outside her grasp. Like when you break something and fix it, and it is stronger in the crack part. "Dad, you told me that. About the Japanese thing. Kintsugi." "Yeah." Zoe looked back at Diana. "I hope she gets to be that." She went back to her drawing. Calvin stood very still for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "Your mom used to say something like that?" "I know," Zoe said. "That is where you got it." Diana's throat closed around something she could not name. Not grief exactly. Not guilt exactly. Something that combined the two and added a third element. She had no word for the particular ache of understanding. Too late. The value of a thing you never looked at directly. She had spent 48 years treating vulnerability as a design flaw. She had watched her father lose everything to it, and had concluded that the solution was to become the kind of person who could not be touched. She had not considered that becoming untouchable and becoming unable to touch were the same transformation. She wanted to open her eyes, not to strategize, not to deploy the information she had been collecting like ammunition. She wanted to open her eyes because a 9-year-old girl had just said something true and generous about a woman who had, by any fair accounting, helped destroy her familyhood, and that girl deserved to be looked at when she said it. Diana did not open her eyes. She was not strong enough yet, and she needed every fraction of that strength for what was coming. But something had shifted. A door she had kept locked for a very long time had developed a crack. That night, Stuart came back. He came with Leonard and Farrell, and the three of them stood in her room and finalized arrangements with the brisk efficiency of people completing a transaction. Diana listened to transfer protocols, sedation schedules, documentation procedures. She listened to Leonard confirm that the Eastgate file, along with 4 related properties, had been moved to encrypted storage, pending a legal review that would conclude on no timeline anyone intended to keep. Then Stuart said, "Pull up the full address list. I want to confirm all 6 before we seal this." Leonard read from his tablet. 5 addresses Diana recognized. Then a 6th, a building on Calloway Street that Diana knew because she had personally approved its acquisition 8 years ago. A mixed-use redevelopment. Ground floor retail. Residential above. She remembered the pitch deck. Clean lines. Good returns. A neighborhood just beginning to gentrify. She had not known, or had not made herself know, that the ground floor retail at the time of acquisition included a licensed daycare. The structural issues flagged in that building had been noted in the same cost reduction review as Eastgate. The same delay order. Her signature. Stewart closed the portfolio. Friday morning, he said. Once she is at Westbrook, this is done. He paused at the foot of her bed. Diana felt his gaze on her, assessing. The way he had always assessed her. Looking for an angle. Even if she wakes up, he said to Leonard, almost conversationally, a woman with a documented head injury and 2 weeks of sedation-adjacent medication in her system. Who is going to believe her over a board resolution and 2 independent medical opinions? He let that settle. Then he turned off the lamp on the bedside table, and the room went dark, and Diana lay in that darkness with the full weight of what she had just heard pressing down on her like a physical thing. She was not the only one. She had known it intellectually, that the practices that had failed Renee Webb were systemic, that the culture of minimum viable safety had not been a single decision, but 100 small ones, each of them signed and filed and forgotten. She had known this the way executives know uncomfortable truths, at a distance, in abstract language, through the buffer of process and legal review, and the comforting fiction that someone else was ultimately responsible. Now she knew it the way Calvin Webb knew it, as names, as addresses, as the specific weight of a decision that seemed like paperwork until it became someone's last morning. Diana pressed her fingers into the mattress and felt, with focused and deliberate attention, the slow, imperfect, insufficient response of a body beginning just barely to answer. Friday, she thought. 3 days. She did not sleep. The accusation came Thursday evening, 8 days after the crash, 1 day before the scheduled transfer. Diana heard it from her bed, the raised voice of a security supervisor in the hallway, the measured, careful response of a man who had clearly learned that raising his own voice in situations like this made things worse, not better. She recognized Calvin's voice before she understood what was being said. A bracelet. An antique gold bracelet that had been cataloged among Diana's personal effects at intake. Missing from the bedside drawer since Wednesday. A staff member had reported seeing Calvin near the drawer during his shift. The bracelet had been a gift from no one. Diana had bought it for herself 7 years ago, after closing the largest deal of her career. She had a very strong suspicion of where it currently was. In the hallway, the conversation reached its conclusion. Calvin would need to leave the floor pending a formal review. His access badge was suspended. He would be escorted out. Zoe was with him. Diana had not known that. She heard the child's voice, not crying, not arguing, just asking her father in a small and careful voice what was happening, and she heard Calvin crouch down, the shift of his weight audible even from here. And she heard him say, "Don't let their lie become your anger. Truth walks slower than shame, but it still arrives." Pause. "You believe me, right?" Zoe asked. "Always," he said. "Now let us walk out of here like we know exactly who we are." The sound of footsteps, diminishing, gone. Diana lay in the silence they left behind and felt something give way inside her chest, not collapse, exactly. More like the specific structural failure of a wall that has been load-bearing for so long that the building has forgotten it was ever a choice. She had heard hundreds of speeches in her life. She had paid consultants significant money to craft language that would move people, inspire loyalty, project strength. Calvin Webb had just crouched in a hospital hallway and told his daughter how to walk out of an unjust situation with her dignity intact. No audience, no calculation, no version of the world in which that speech benefited him in any measurable way. She thought about her own father, not the diminished version, the one after, but the one before. The one who had come to her school plays and made bad jokes at dinner and believed, with a simplicity she had found embarrassing as a teenager, that people were fundamentally worth trusting. She had spent her entire adult life building a fortress against that simplicity. She was not sure, lying here in the dark, that the fortress had been worth what it cost to build. Friday arrived gray and quiet. Ruth came in at 6 to check vitals. She was efficient and unhurried, The way experienced nurses are her attention complete without being intrusive. She noted Diana's numbers, updated the chart, and was about to leave when she paused. She looked at Diana's hand. Diana's fingers were pressed flat against the mattress, not the slack, gravity-arranged position of unconsciousness, but the deliberate, isometric stillness of a person holding position. Ruth had been a nurse for 27 years. She had noticed subtle signs across the past 2 days, a slight change in Diana's muscle tone, the way her eyes moved faintly beneath closed lids in response to specific voices rather than random sound. She had been waiting for Diana to be ready. She stood very still. Diana felt the woman's gaze and made her decision. Slowly, with the enormous effort of someone moving through deep water, she turned her hand over, palm up, and then, one by one, she closed her fingers around the nurse's hand. Ruth did not make a sound. She looked down at Diana's hand holding hers, and then she looked at Diana's face, and then carefully, in a voice that gave nothing away to the room, she said, "Squeeze once for yes. Can you hear me?" Diana squeezed. Ruth exhaled slowly through her nose. "How long?" Diana held up 2 fingers, then 5, then 2 again. "Since the second day, 1 squeeze." Ruth closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, her expression had settled into something Diana recognized, not anger, not shock, but the focused clarity of a person who has understood the full scope of a situation and is already calculating what to do about it. "There are people coming this morning to transfer you," Ruth said quietly. "I have had concerns about that arrangement since it was first proposed. The room's documentation system records to the hospital's central server. It cannot be deleted from an individual terminal." She met Diana's eyes. "I am going to activate it now. Is there someone you need me to locate first?" Diana pointed toward the door. "Calvin Webb. He was escorted out last night." Ruth straightened. "Security holds suspension paperwork for 12 hours. He may still be in the building. I will find him." Stewart arrived at 8:45 with Leonard and Farrell. They came in with the brisk confidence of people completing a formality. Farrell set his leather portfolio on the table near the window and began laying out transfer documents. Stewart was reading from his phone the board resolution language, and Leonard was confirming an intake protocol detail, and the room had the specific atmosphere of a transaction about to close. Then Stewart looked up and read the Callaway Street address aloud from his screen, confirming it to himself, checking it off the list. Diana had been waiting for that. She had been holding still through the footsteps and the rustling papers and the low professional voices, gathering everything she had left, which was not much, but which was going to be enough. She thought about Renee Webb in a stairwell on a Tuesday afternoon. She thought about a daycare on the ground floor of a building whose structural review she had signed off on without reading. She thought about Zoe asking her father if she believed him, and Calvin saying always in a voice that cost him something to mean. She moved her arm. The cup on the bedside table, plastic, half full of water, hit the floor with a sharp, flat crack. Everyone froze. Farrell looked up. Leonard turned. Stewart's face cycled through surprise, and then, very quickly, the managed neutrality of a man recalculating. "Reflex," he said. "She has been having intermittent motor responses." The team at Westbrook. Diana opened her eyes. The light hit hard. Her vision swam, then steadied. She looked at the ceiling first, then slowly. With the full deliberate weight of everything she had been saving, she turned her head and looked directly at her brother. Stewart went pale. She could not speak clearly. Her voice, when she tried it, came out fractured and hoarse, less than a whisper, barely more than breath. But she had one word. One word that Ruth, who had stepped into the doorway exactly on cue, would understand. Diana looked at the small camera mounted in the upper corner of the room and said, "Record." It came out rough and barely audible, but it came out. Ruth reached to the panel beside the door. The indicator light above the camera shifted from amber to red. Stewart took a step forward. "Diana." She held up her hand, imperfect, trembling, unambiguous. The door opened. Calvin Webb stood in the hallway, still in the building, paperwork unresolved, present by the precise bureaucratic delay Diana had spent the night counting on. He looked at Diana, at her open eyes, at the red light above the camera. He understood. What followed was neither dramatic nor fast. Diana could not speak in sustained sentences for another 4 days. What she could do with Calvin beside her bed, with Ruth operating the documentation system, with a hospital administrator who arrived within the hour was communicate. She blinked. She squeezed hands. She pointed at documents that Leonard, under the administrator's supervision, was required to produce. She confirmed names. She identified the Eastgate file and the 5 associated addresses by nodding at each one as Calvin read them aloud. Stewart tried to interrupt the process on legal grounds. The administrator informed him that the hospital's obligation was to its patient, and that its patient was conscious and communicating, and that any attempt to proceed with the transfer under those circumstances would be documented in full. Leonard stopped speaking after the first hour. The police arrived the following morning. Stewart and Leonard were taken in for questioning before noon. Farrell surrendered his credentials to the state medical board by the end of the week and faced a formal hearing that would ultimately cost him his license. 6 weeks after the crash, Diana stood at a podium in the hospital's family meeting room and gave the statement she had been drafting in her head since the night she heard Stewart read the Calloway Street address aloud. She had not hired a communications consultant. She had not run the language past legal. She had written it herself, by hand. In the narrow notepad, Ruth had brought her during her second week of recovery. Her hands were steadier than she expected when she gripped the podium. She had rehearsed this moment many times, in her mind, but standing here in a room with fluorescent lighting and folding chairs, and the specific silence of people who have been hurt and are waiting to see whether the person in front of them understands that she felt something she had not prepared for. The full, unmediated weight of being seen, not admired, not feared, seen. She said that her company had knowingly deferred critical structural repairs across multiple residential properties in order to protect short-term financial performance. She said that the decisions which enabled those deferrals were made in a culture she had created, maintained, and personally benefited from. She said that Renee Webb was one of at least 3 people whose deaths were directly linked to conditions her company had allowed to persist. Then she said their names, all 3, out loud, in a room where people were paying attention. Her voice did not break. She had decided it would not because she was not moved, but because she owed these names steadiness, not performance. She stepped down as CEO, pending a full independent review. She unsealed the housing files. She established a compensation fund for affected families, structured with independent oversight so that it could not be redirected by internal board action. She asked Calvin to serve on the tenant safety board. He said no. He told her, in the hospital corridor, with Zoe waiting down the hall by the elevator, that he had watched powerful people apologize before and that the apology was usually the last thing they did before returning to exactly who they had been. He said he was not interested in being used as evidence that she had changed. Diana looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "That is fair." She began the work anyway. 4 months later, on a Thursday evening in early autumn, Diana drove herself to a community meeting in the repaired Eastgate building. She had not announced she was coming. There was no press. There was no assistant. She sat in the last row of folding chairs in a room that smelled like old carpet and fresh paint, and she listened. Calvin stood at the front of the room and spoke about structural accountability, the legal kind, the moral kind, the kind that lives in the gap between what a building inspector signs off on and what the people inside the building actually need. He spoke about Renee without saying her name, the way people speak about the dead when they have made a kind of peace with the loss without having resolved it. He spoke about what his daughter had taught him about the difference between carrying grief and being consumed by it. He did not look toward the back of the room. After the meeting, while people collected their coats and finished conversations, Zoe appeared at Diana's elbow with the abrupt materialization that children accomplish when adults are not paying attention. She looked up at Diana with her father's eyes. "Are you better?" she asked. Diana considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I am trying to become someone who does less harm than she used to," she said. Zoe thought about this. "That is a weird way to say yes." "I know," Diana said. "It is the most honest answer I have." Zoe nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to find her father. Calvin was near the door, talking to 2 other residents. He noticed Diana as she moved toward the exit. He did not smile. He did not nod. But he held her gaze for a moment long enough to be deliberate, brief enough to say nothing more than, "I see you here." Diana walked out into the autumn evening alone. No cameras. No car waiting at the curb. No statement to release in the morning. For 48 years, she had measured the value of a room by whether people watched her enter it. She had calibrated her worth in coverage, in deals closed, in the particular quality of silence that fell when she walked into spaces designed for people with power. She walked 2 blocks to where she had parked, and she sat in her car for a moment before starting the engine, and she thought about a man cleaning a hospital floor in the middle of the night, talking to a woman he did not know was listening, because he believed no person should be left entirely alone. She started the car. There was a lot of work still to do. There would be days when she did it well, and days when she fell back into the habits of 40 years. There would be people who never believed her and people who forgave her too easily, and neither of those things was the point. The point was that real change is not proven in the moment everyone is watching. It is proven in every moment after that.